All right, everybody, this is Mr. Southall. I'm going to wrap your Unit 3 notes up for AP Euro for the week of homecoming, and that way your test will be on Monday. So we just got this one last slide to take quick notes on, and we'll be done. So looking at the new economic elite. The growth of towns and commerce with large-scale buying and selling made merchants and bankers more powerful in the same places, more so than nobles who own land in the same areas. So the growth of towns and commerce that led to large-scale buying and selling made merchants and bankers more powerful in some places than actual nobles who own land, as we kind of mentioned before. So merchants are on the rise, becoming more powerful than nobles who own land. In some states, rulers granted titles of nobility to powerful merchants and bankers. So basically, they could, earn their way up into that level of society. So there's some actual states and rulers who allowed some titles of nobility to be given to merchants and bankers who became so super wealthy. The Fuggers in Central Europe are an example of that, ones who are in the Holy Roman Empire. So that's one example, the Fuggers in Central Europe. In the 1600s, Amsterdam's wealthy merchants, manufacturers, and shipyard owners were at the top of the social scale. So in the 1600s, Amsterdam's wealthy merchants, manufacturers, and shipyard owners were at the top of the social scale. These elites controlled city government and the nation's legislative body. So these elites control the city governments and the nation's legislative body. Land-owning nobles were now a step below this new elite. So what starts to happen is you get these different states, especially like what you see here with the Dutch in Amsterdam, is that these new wealthy merchants, people who actually have money, become now more elite than the old land-owning nobles from the old feudal system. So all that's starting to change now as a result. So for gentry in London, London was similar to Amsterdam in this period, as a small number of merchants controlled the city. So London was similar to Amsterdam in this period, meaning like the 1600s, as a small number of merchants controlled the city. Increase in wealth could improve a person's rank in society. So an increase in wealth could actually help lead to a increase in rank of people in society. In spite of London's growing importance, England remained about 80% rural in the early 1600s. So in spite of London's growing importance in England, England remained about 80% rural in the early 1600s. Because the landed nobility, the guys from the old feudal systems, still had the highest status in the English countryside. So these guys did not migrate to London. They still had a higher status as being these landlords out in the countrysides of England itself. So that's where they remained. But a growing number of gentry or wealthy landowners, which is what gentry means, so a growing number of gentry or wealthy landowners without titles were growing in influence. And eventually, like we see everywhere else, these growing gentry are going to overcome the landed nobles that are in England. Okay, the established hierarchies. Even with new economic elites, people in the 1600s knew their hierarchies were established based on class, religion, and gender. So even with new economic elites, people in the 1600s knew their hierarchies were established based on class, religion, and gender. So we're going to go through each one, class, religion, and gender. So first we're going to look at class. This was determined by birth and wealth. Of course, the monarchy and the nobility at the top. So this is determined by birth and wealth. Monarchy and nobility are at the top. Commercial economies allow for some social mobility, like merchants and manufacturers and bankers. So the commercial economy that was emerging now in the 1600s allowed for more social mobility with merchants and manufacturers and bankers. In France, the nobles of the robe, and that's a term you want to be aware of because it does show up in the key concepts. The nobles of the robe means people holding admin or judicial offices, because usually they had robes they wore. So these nobles of the robe, also known as people holding administrative or judicial offices, were not landowners and could pay for their positions to be hereditary. So these nobles of the robe in France were not landowners, and they actually could pay for their positions to become hereditary for their children and their children's children. Yet some privileges and perceptions were still attached to ownership of land. Even though they weren't as worth as much as they used to be, there was still this high status of people owning land during this time period, like the landed nobles in the House of Lords in England. Even though they may not represent many people anymore, having that land is very important to the people back then. Excluded from taxes or service fees as well. So a lot of these landed noble guys, the people who are the traditional nobles from the feudal system, were also exempt or excluded from certain taxes or service fees. That might become an issue in the future. You know, hint, hint, that down the road there might be some people who are really upset, these really rich guys who have land and who influence the government and pay no taxes, maybe not should keep those jobs anymore, and that might come back to bite them down the road. All right, the next topic is religion. In most places, Christians who dissented from a country's established church suffered discrimination. So we've already talked about that, like in France, the Huguenots, Lutherans, and HRE, and so on. So Christians who dissented from their own country's established church could face discrimination. Jews were often expelled or forced to practice in secret because of discrimination. So Jews were not welcomed in multiple European countries because they were different in their religion. There was a few places they were welcome, like Amsterdam. So in Amsterdam welcomed them, and actually it's one of the reasons why the Dutch prosper, because they have all these skilled, Jewish people who come to their country and help their country prosper. So Jews do get to go to Amsterdam. Some get to go to Poland in those areas. With such a diverse population in Amsterdam, it encouraged more toleration because it helped actually boost their economy. So Amsterdam and the Dutch were actually more tolerant towards different religions, and as a result, they grew in their trade and wealth because they had all these different minds and people coming there to their country. And lastly, you have gender. In European society, remained very patriarchal, meaning that the men dominated the households and the law systems. So in European society across the board, the society remained very patriarchal, as men control the government and public life, in addition to public households. Basically, the way legal systems worked is that it's kind of like the king, like the man was literally the king of his household, where men had all the legal authority within the household versus like the wife or his children. Women were under the authority of their fathers until eventually they were under the authority of their husbands. Women had value as home workers, but their earnings legally belonged to men. So women did have value as home workers, but their earnings legally belonged to men. There was even provisions like if you beat up on your wife because she was being irrational, or you argued that she stepped out of line, whatever, was considered to be legal or okay because it was part of the man's domain within the household. Obviously, this is all crazy and not great in the modern context, but that's what they thought back then. So anyway, that's what we're looking at here in terms of the end of the unit. And these are some things that are not in the textbooks. Make sure you get the notes. These notes will be made available also on Moodle. Remember that your test is this Monday. Don't forget to study the old test. Unit 2 will be posted to Moodle as well, so you can look at those old questions. Other than that, have a great weekend. Do well on the test. Good luck. Thank you. Bye.